So again, welcome to this, and I so wish, I'm reiterating myself here, that I could be in Paris with you all live. The vibrancy of the city hopefully will make this a very successful meeting. I'm looking forward to getting as much of this as possible. And I really want to thank Jeff Wong for his mentorship, guidance, and my partner, Michael Canas from São Paulo. Again, Jeff identified very clearly that there's a strong interrelation of spine and function. We do spine surgery to enhance function of our patients, whether they're paralyzed or whether they are fully intact. So I have to turn off a loudspeaker here. We have a feedback. So the spine, we do spine care to enhance function of our patients, period. Secondly, sports and spine are clearly in an adversarial, challenging fashion intertwined. They're very heavily dependent upon one another, but also to some degree can be a decrement of one another, especially in higher performance or at-risk populations. And thirdly, again, sports can challenge us in spine care to go and ascend to a higher level in terms of what we do care-wise. It's clearly something where we in spine surgery, as well as the implant manufacturers and technology purveyors, are challenged to kind of get to a higher level as we're moving on. Today in this program, we have 3 general sections. Roughly, they're 1.5 hours long. First, we'll start off with neurologic injuries. Secondly, common conditions in the spine that frequently evoke questions. And thirdly, hosted live from Paris through Michael Canas, we have an international group of members looking at cases. So common conditions, again, stress fracture physiology. Bruce Twaddle is going to talk live from Auckland, New Zealand. Return to play Wellington Shue is one of the international leaders on this topic, looking at high collision and contact sports. And we have a great lecture also on the interrelationship of sports and spine from Patrick Kearney. And we'll conclude with case reviews. We'll start off with a neurologic injury section, which will start with an attorney named Richard Adler. Ben, are we ready to start firing that? Richard Adler is little known outside of the US, but with our current obsession on traumatic brain injuries in all contact sports, we thought it would be very appropriate to explore the topic of traumatic brain injuries in the spine meeting. The reason is several-fold. Number one, most of us serve as team physicians or asked to evaluate athletes, and traumatic brain injuries are ubiquitous. Number two, Mr. Adler is an attorney, but he has single-handedly changed laws in the US dating back to 2006 through several high-profile litigations that basically created this whole wave of increased awareness of spine injuries and, of head injuries being a very important part to recognize with. And he's done that through legislation, he's done it through media work. I thought it would be very helpful for all of us who are hopefully going to be more and more vocal activists to become really very vocal about this and activists in terms of trying to protect our athletes from spinal cord injuries. And thirdly, so this mechanism will be shown by him and how he's done this effectively. Thirdly, I thought it would be interesting just to extrapolate from the head injury to basically our spinal cord and spinal cord conditions. And that'll be the second and the third lecturer. So I have a echo here again. That basically will go into Michael Feelings and his work on spinal cord concussions in athletes, and Dr. Ronan Bletcher from Ashkelon in Israel, who's identified neurodegenerative disorders as a late result of spinal cord concussions. Without much further ado, we'll start off with a presentation by Mr. Richard Adler, and I'll be taking some questions. Mr. Adler can't be here live right now because he had to be out of town at a different litigation, but we pre-taped this. So, Mr. Richard Adler, and I hope you'll find this exploration of C0 injuries for the next 25 minutes interesting.
Good morning, everyone. I am delighted to be able to present to you, I think, a topic of great importance. I want to thank Dr. Chapman for the invitation and the very, very kind words this morning. I wish I could be there with you, but I am out of country right now. And some of you might be asking, what is an attorney doing talking to us here at an international conference? Why is an attorney talking to medical doctors? Why is an attorney talking to spine surgeons? Well, it feels a little bit like this to me, which is a famous character magazine from the United States called Alfred E. Newman, Mad Magazine. What, me? Well, really, the reason I'm talking to you is because I always think it's a good idea to get counsel, get some wisdom, get some reliable advice on things that are all related to medicine, whether it's your employment contract with your employer, whether it's bringing in a new partner or exiting an old partner, whether you're involved in a real estate transaction, or whether you're just needing a refresher on standard of care issues. But why am I talking to you on the issue of spine? I'm not here about spine, I'm here about traumatic brain injury. And my understanding in your world as orthopedic surgeons, many of you are involved in the sports world because of the surgical complications that occur to players at the elite level as well as the mini level or the peewee level or the high school level. And the sports world is now all about understanding complications that come from return to play following brain trauma. And so the reason I'm here is to talk to you and share information with you on a lifelong passion and journey that I've had in that space in that. By way of disclosures and my organizations that I'm involved in, nothing related to pharmaceuticals or medical, but a lot related to seeking justice for my clients and community participation in educating the public around issues related to brain trauma. I want to introduce you to a client of mine who was involved in a brain injury playing youth football for his middle school team. Zachary is a 13-year-old boy at the time, a really good kid, only child. GPA is academically inclined, 3.5. He played exceptional football, played exceptional baseball. He was one of those kids that could do so many things. October 12, 2016, in the game, about 3 plays before halftime, he ran across the field, tackling some kid a bit faster and bigger than him right at the end zone. He was taken out of the game at that point for 1 play. He was taken to the sidelines. He was cleared by his coach to come back in the second half because this kid was one of the star players on the team. And there's the arrow pointing to where Zachy is running across the field. He's going to catch up, tackles, he comes around. Wow. We're all very familiar with issues of acceleration, deceleration forces. It's not the acceleration that hurts, it's the deceleration. We're also very familiar with the rotational forces, probably the more dangerous ones when you're dealing with the brain. So this is not a helmet-to-helmet hit. This is a helmet-to-ground with rotational forces with pretty significant deceleration speed. They had an official timeout back in the day of 2006. In our jurisdiction, he was required to be taken out for 1 play, and anybody could clear him to come back to play. Unfortunately, it was one of his coaches who really had no business making a clearance decision. So as we take a step back in a 360 on it, how big is traumatic brain injury in the United States? The Centers for Disease Control in early 2000 labeled it a silent epidemic. Even from early 2000s into 2014, we know that there's about 52,000 people who die each year from TBI. We have about 283,000 who are hospitalized because of TBI. And we know that there's about 2.5 emergency room visits with people with TBI. Fairly significant issue. It is an epidemic, but with the education and awareness becoming less so, but the epidemic remains. There's some data here from the Centers for Disease Control talking about the number of folks who are involved in sports and recreational concussions per year, and I'm talking about primarily of youth athletes. Fairly significant numbers. And this is not just a football and boys problem or American football and boys problem. This is for all athletes across the spectrum: basketball, football, soccer, what Europeans will call football, baseball, skydiving, swimming, cheerleading. It covers the full range of things. And when we consider that the number of athletes in the United States, there's about 55 million, and it starts with youth athletes at about 40 million, up to the pinnacle of elite sports at 40,000. Each year, according to the data, 10% of all contact sport athletes sustain a concussion. 10%. And an athlete who sustains their first concussion is actually statistically 4 to 6 times more likely to have their second concussion. And it's those second and third concussions that you've got to be really concerned with. You can't prevent a concussion, but you can prevent the bad consequences from not understanding the biophysics, the chemistry behind what's happening at a very cellular, molecular level. But we do know this: concussions are cumulative in nature. It's not just you had one concussion and then another one, therefore you have two. It has kind of a synergistic effect where there's 1 + 1 could be 2, 3, or 4 in terms of its functional disturbance. The good news is these are preventable. The bad news is sometimes they're not. And I think the doctors form that first line of defense in terms of proper clearance. In the United States, and particularly in high school sports, football for guys is the #1 cause of these concussions. However, for girls, they're right behind it in terms of a leading cause. Technically, or medically speaking, concussion is defined as a complex pathophysiological process affecting the brain induced by traumatic biomechanical forces. When we dive deeper into the definition from your own medical societies, they talk about concussions can be caused by a direct blow, so a helmet to helmet, helmet to ground. It could also be caused by a blow to the body with an impulsive force transmitted to the head. So you may run out on the field because somebody has a shoulder injury and they can't move, or they twisted their back from a hit, or they now have a knee injury. But depending upon how they went down, the forces involved may have transmitted something going on to the brain. And you as clinicians, you as sports medical doctors, need to just be aware of that. We know that concussions cause changes to the brain's chemistry, but it's not going to show up in an acute clinical situation. It's going to show up more in functional disturbances. The tools that many doctors use to try to evaluate, particularly ERs, whether the concussion is bad is whether there's a bleed, is going to be a CT scan or an MRI. But those are universally negative for showing anything, but it doesn't mean it's time to clear a kid because we know that kids are more vulnerable than adults, epidemiologically speaking. We know that the pathophysiology of concussion creates a neurometabolic cascade, which involves the transition of certain chemicals that are supposed to be within the cell and certain chemicals are supposed to be outside the cell. They've now reversed themselves because of a break in the cellular body. Glutamate, calcium, glucose, potassium are not sure where they're supposed to go and what's happening. We know that from this chemical cascade, there are a few takeaways. First off, the Centers for Disease Control have labeled a concussion. It's no longer a ding or getting your bell rung. It is, in fact, a traumatic brain injury. All brain injuries are serious, and a youth athlete's brain is much more vulnerable than an adult brain. They do not know why. They just know that by epidemiological studies, it is true. Some takeaways involve that the brain tissue is just more vulnerable than other tissue in the body. We know that the brain injury is an evolving event. It's not a static. It's not you take a picture one day and that's what it looks like. It's not a fracture. Surveillance is needed by the practitioner even after there's a return to play protocol, process, as well as final clearance. Essentially, the brain needs time to recover and you can't rush it, no matter how important that player is to the team and know how important that game is to the overall season. There are many symptoms that come with concussion, from cognitive, somatic, affect, and sleep, but the #1 symptom to be on watch for is the issue of headaches. #2 would be dizziness, but headaches is the primary culprit and a good way to evaluate how a child is doing. In terms of how we managed to get some change, I kind of come back to Victor Hugo's quote, "There is nothing so powerful as an idea whose time has come." And back in 2006, that idea was Zachary Lysted. And whenever I think of attorneys and doctors working together, I come across Margaret Mead's quote, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, that's the only thing that ever has. And as you hear the next few slides, you'll see what I mean. In representing Zach on his underlying claim of premature return to play without proper clearance, we began a local model in the United States out of the state of Washington. On a state basis, we had a Brain Injury Alliance of Washington, a nonprofit group. We hooked up with a national organization, the Centers for Disease Control, and we brought in a professional sports team, the Seattle Seahawks. Between these three partners, we were able to approach the CDC and the Department of Health for the United States, and we had these produced and co-branded with the Seahawks, the Brain Injury Alliance of Washington, and the Centers for Disease Control. We also had clipboards made. Actually, they were created by the CDC. They were sitting in their warehouse in Atlanta, Georgia, until we called and said, can we have about 10, 20, 30,000 of these for distribution? You'll notice on the back of these clipboards is actually the return to play guidelines and symptoms and things for coaches to be watching for. Again, we had these co-branded. And we also leaned out to the professional football coach for the Seattle Seahawks. His name is Mike Holgram, who wrote a letter, and that letter was packaged with the posters and packaged with the clipboards and was sent to every high school coach and every assistant coach in the state of Washington. We did about 4,000 to 5,000 mailings to get these into the hands of the coaches. We were on a mission to try to prevent another Zachary Lysted from happening. And we embarked upon a plan of education, education, education. Really a bottom-up approach. Here's a map where it shows you a cutout of the state of Washington. To the north of us is Canada. To the right is Idaho. Below us is Oregon. But we began a campaign in talking to school district boards, to school administrators, to coaches, to athletic trainers, all across the state. But despite continued educational messaging, a problem remained. And it came to our attention ahead after about a year and a half of heavy push on education. This special report came out from a local newspaper, the Seattle Times, in November of 2008, highlighting continued problems that were occurring around issues of premature return to play of youth athletes, particularly in high school football. We then sat down and said, well, we got to stop. We're doing all this education. We're spending a lot of time and resources and money, but this is still happening. What do we need to do? What's going wrong? What's the problem? We came away with a few points for us, which I think apply to anyone trying to do anything similar on any type of medical, legal type of issue. Education alone doesn't have stickiness. You can think about seatbelts, you can think about smoking, you can think about brain injury. It just doesn't have stickiness. A certain part of the population will get it, many others won't. And you could talk about vaccines as well. We know that attempts at policy change don't happen overnight. You got to present to a school board, they need to pass a resolution, and that takes time. And once a policy is changed at a higher level, you then have the implementation. And the implementation could be very slow and could be somewhat inconsistent. When you put A, B, and C together, you end up with a patchwork of policies and procedures from one school district to the next, one organization within the school district to the next, and even one coach to the next on a kind of a microscopic level. Consider this as we looked at our map of all the counties in the state of Washington. There are quite a number. Seattle is based in King County in that green position in the middle of the slide. Major population center. So let's just look at that and see how many school districts that one has by itself. King County has low teens of school districts, and each of those school districts have multiple schools. Each of those school districts with multiple schools have multiple coaches, multiple school boards, multiple of everything. And trying to get education across from a ground level up position could take 20, 30 years, just as the anti-tobacco campaign took, just as the seatbelt campaign took hold as well. So we said we got to do a bit more, and we got to grow our three-entity partnership of the CDC, the Brain Injury Alliance, and the American football team, Seattle Seahawks. We brought in the Washington Interscholastic Activities Association. We brought in youth soccer. We brought in Seattle Children's hospital. We brought in the athletic trainers and also the risk management pool for the state. We brought in the Trauma One Center. We brought in the medical center. So we tried the education bottom-up approach, and we decided it was time to do some legislative change and make a law change. This would be called a top-down approach. However, in my world, we know two things in life you never want to see how they're made. One are laws, and the other one are sausages. We were able to pull together with that coalition, that statewide coalition, three core principles, what we named after our client, Zachary Lysted, the Lysted Law: education, immediate removal, and proper clearance. In very quick summary, on a yearly basis, every kid 18 and under in every sport in every school would be required to review with their parent and sign a concussion and head injury information sheet. So even the 5-year-old who's sitting down in kindergarten playing a peewee soccer game would have to go through that with the parent and for the parent to explain it to the child. Here we hope to get some stickiness with a kid who is age 5, 6, or 7, all the way through 18 would be seeing this information sheet year after year. Another core principle, and a really important one, is the understanding that we were targeting youth athletes, not just student athletes. So the law said a youth athlete who is suspected. We're not looking for actually a doctor to come on the field and diagnose the concussion. We just want to say if there's suspicion that something happened, it requires a removal at that point in time. No ifs, ands, or buts. Once they're on the sideline, proper clearance can only be done not by the coach, not by the kid, not by the parent, not by anybody other than a licensed healthcare provider who is actually trained in the evaluation and management of concussion and puts that evaluation and clearance in writing. By way of timeline, Zachary's injury, October 12, 2006. Our education and coalition partnership building campaign, 2000 to 2008. And on May 14th, 2009, in a very short period of time, we got the first law in the United States signed by the then governor of the state of Washington. And I'd like to share with you this picture from May 14th, 2009. You could see the governor in the green. You could see to her right, Mercedes Lysted, Zachary in the wheelchair holding his dad's hand, and all the other stakeholders involved in that coalition for the state of Washington. Around the same time, the American College of Sports Medicine, the largest sports healthcare organization in the world, was having its national conference in Seattle in May of 2009. Talk about synchronicity. They called an executive board meeting after the governor signed the legislation, and the executive board came out with a national call to action. This was at the 56th annual ACSM convention. We then began to take this story on the road and started visiting places, California, Florida, Texas, and we also decided it was time to bring in some national players. We had asked the Centers for Disease Control and the American College of Sports Medicine to talk to the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke. We also approached the National Federation of High School Coaches. We had everybody we can get involved, but one of the key players, just as American football was the Seattle Seahawks, having the National Football League get involved in this campaign was a very important turning point to make this a national campaign. And from that first state, we were able to pass legislation on the three core principles in every state in the United States. It's 50 states over a 4.5 year period, a lightning speed for any public health initiative ever in the United States history. And following that, what happened was a change in the conversation at the coffee table, kitchen table with parents and kids around TBI. All these organizations from the government and private leagues were beginning to realize that they had a problem on their hand that they had been ignoring for quite some time. And it led to an accelerated area of funding and research which we had not seen ever before. I want you to take a look at the stats that I pulled from PubMed. This was me pulling the data. Look at the keywords. Look at the first 10 years from 90 to 1999, the number of studies published in each area with those keywords. Jump forward to 2006. So Zachary's injury was October 12, 2006. The law got passed in May of 2009. Look at the jump that happens there. Not so big in that 2-year period, but look what's happened since 2011 to 2021. We've gone from 1,140 to 4,010, roughly 3,000-fold increase in studies that have been published and cited through PubMed. So education and laws, that's good, but we got a bigger problem, which the problem is changing behaviors. You can have education, you can have ground-up perspective, you can have a top-down approach, but it's almost like we're making a sandwich, and what's in the middle remains is a changing of behavior among all the stakeholders, whether it's school boards, whether it's coaches, whether it's parents, athletic trainers, but primarily we've taken coaches and parents and kids out of the equation. Decisions are being made by trainers, but there's also changes of behavior that are needed around those folks as well as docs. Now, we thought we had things licked with changes of behavior, but along comes Kenny Bowie, September 4th, 2015. This is in a city just south of Seattle. Kenny's born in 1998, 17 years old when this happens. Pre-season, so again, good policy, there's cognitive testing of all kids playing sports. So they have a baseline of how the kid performs on motor, sensory, cognitive functions. September 4th, he has a helmet-to-helmet hit. We see it on a video. He's removed by the athletic trainer. He complains of headache. They take his helmet, which is a sign he's not going back in the game. The athletic trainer the next day sends him to his primary care doctor, who happens to also be a pediatrician, who also is versed in sports medicine. The doctor looks at him on September 9th, a few days after the referral. He's given a okay to return to clearance to begin a return to play protocol, but not final clearance. And he's told by the physician, Kenny, I want you to come back and see me on September 17th. He transmits that communication to the school district, the athletic director, and the athletic trainer. On September 15th, 2 days before he's supposed to report back to his doctor for a final review, the athletic trainer clears him for full contact. But he had never gone back to the doctor. They never did any post-concussion impact testing to compare it with pre-season results. And no athletic director was reviewing the return to play for him. So we had great policy, we had great procedures, we had great education, we got a law, but the implementation and changing behaviors just didn't catch, even as late as 2015. Bowie's removed from a game on October 2nd. He collapses on the sideline. He's taken to the Trauma 1 Center in Seattle, Harborview. He's got a massive subdural bleed, decompression to the brainstem. He's taken off of support, and he passes on October 5 at age 17. It's really around changing behaviors. What we did in Zachary's name is create a law. What we've done in Kenny Bowie's name is to create a new rule that's implemented in all high school sports in the state of Washington. As you can see from the quote from the nonprofit group, Washington's first-in-the-nation legislation turned best medical practices into a uniform law requiring removal of a youth athlete from practice or competition following suspicion of concussion and medical clearance. But, here's the but, the changing of behavior. It left the implementation on how to satisfy that mandate to the school districts. Now that mandate has been taken away from the school districts, and now there's a Kenny Bowie rule, which further defines the implementation by requiring all schools to have medical clearance plus written clearance from the school's athletic director, and they now must use only one form. There's no longer experimentation with forms and procedures allowed. It is known as the Kenny Bowie rule. Again, never doubt that a small group of you and me together working, we can change things. It didn't take much, took time, took patience, took focus. For those that are interested in looking at this return to practice and competition for youth athletes suspected of a concussion, that'll be available at the website of the WIAA.com. I'm sure that Dr. Chapman will make that available as well. I've been allowed to share with you the fact that I have just written a book for survivors and caregivers called Understanding Traumatic Brain Injury. My editors have been high-level board-certified physicians as well as survivors and caregivers. And I just want to let you know this book is out there for you to read, for you to share. And also, if you're kind enough to purchase one of these on Amazon, this will be all funds collected from the sale of the book, which is $19.95 US, will actually be donated back to the Brain Injury Alliance and other organizations that are looking to improve the lives of those survivors of traumatic brain injury. For the international conference, I want to say in many languages, thank you, Concussion, Shalom, Grazie, Merci, and there's probably more, but Dr. Chapman is looking at me right now saying, your time's up, pal, time to get off. Here's a picture of me and my amazing law partners, and if you need to reach out to me and have questions, you're most welcome to do that. Here's my contact information, both at the office, my law office, as well as the Brain Injury Alliance.